And he looks at me and just says, he's dead. There's nothing you can do. And I just look at this guy, and he's literally, his head is in my lap. 10 years on, I still struggle with this. And Dorji just says, we got to climb. Dorji, we got to climb. And he just looks at me and goes, we should climb. And we're not climbing for him, we're climbing for me. And he knows me so well. And when you go to places in Nepal, Pakistan, and you're in these little villages, or I'm working with my Sherpa crew, the times that we are disconnected from the grid, we don't have our smartphones or devices, we become connected in other ways. I think high performance is quite an individual thing. In its simplest terms, I would say high performance is where an expected outcome is exceeded. And that could be in the individual, it could be in the organization, it could be within a team. Yeah. And because by the very nature of high performance, it's not a level that you can constantly attain, because I think you end up with burnout. Whereas every now and then you would find that, you know, you're operating at, you know, a certain level, and high performance for me is where all of a sudden you can peak. Now you've got to be careful with a peak, because what happens after a peak? A crash. There's potentially a crash. Yeah. But yeah, you're gonna attain something which is perhaps beyond expectation. He's right there. I think it's a great analogy. Bradley Wiggins once said that, you know, trying to maintain like 70-80% all the time, because it's impossible to maintain 100%. You just can't do it. You know, there's a reason why footballers have an off season. There's a reason why the rugby's the same, or whatever it is. So I think what I try to do, I try to operate at a level, a constant level, whereby I know that I can peak when I need to. So I live in the Cotswolds. I go running around the fields pretty much every day. And I try to maintain my fitness whereby I never lose fitness. I'm not starting from ground zero. But in the build up to going to Pakistan, or the build up to going to Everest, I know that I can crank it up when I need to be able to perform at a level which is going to be required in that moment. So yeah, Joe's analogy of the flower will bloom for just a few months of the year, and the rest of the time, the flower is still growing, it's still developing, it's still alive. And I think it's the same. I think it's exactly the same. You know, show me anybody that can operate at 100% the whole time. It just doesn't exist. For me, switching off is pretty easy, in so much that I invest myself in the family. I've got 2 young children. I've got a beautiful wife, live out in the Cotswolds. And it's only recently I was doing a keynote for an organization, and we were talking about Summit Day on Everest. And Everest, this is going to sound utterly ridiculous. Everest I find relatively straightforward. I'm never going to say I'm complacent about it or take it for granted, because that would be very disrespectful for the dangers that exist on that mountain. But we have a really good understanding of the mountain and how to approach it and what we need to do to get high on the mountain. But Summit Day is stress levels and anxiety levels. Certainly for myself as a professional mountain guide, I'm leading somebody into the death zone. I'm leading somebody into an environment where there is no rescue. And I've been doing that for years. And it was only 2 or 3 years ago, I was doing, as I mentioned, doing a keynote, and I realized the level of stress that I'm under in the build up to that day and then during that day. And it's incredible. It's all consuming. So when I find I come back from an expedition, it's a wave, a tsunami of relief that we're out of the death zone. I've done my job. I've looked after this individual. I've got him or her to the summit and back down again, because let's face it, Getting back down is the mandatory part of that expedition. Getting to the top is simply optional. And I get home, and certainly for the first couple of weeks, it's a process of reintegration into Western capitalist society, which I struggle with. But B, it's almost like a stress detox, because the stress levels have been so high in that particular period of time that I think I really struggle with it. So what is it like? It's over a prolonged period of time, and I don't know how unique that is. So I'm a bit of an aviation geek, military aviation. I love it, and I always have done. And I was reading a dialogue from a naval aviator, a Top Gun pilot or something like that. And on approach to landing on a carrier, they are working at maximum capacity. And this particular individual said, if you asked me a question, what's your mother's name? He said, you wouldn't get a response. Predominantly because I've not even heard that question, because I'm operating at maximum capacity to try to land that plane on that carrier and not go off the end or crash into it. And it's not quite like that on Everest, but instead of operating in that environment for a matter of 5 minutes or however long it takes to land a plane on a carrier, I'm operating like that for about a week. So the moment that we decide that we're going to leave base camp, so we're looking at weather forecasting, we're looking at what the Sherpa fixing team is doing, putting the rope to the top. I'm looking at the mental and physical state of my clients. I'm looking at what the Sherpa team's doing. Looking at conditions on the mountain, and all of a sudden we get a weather forecast in, and beforehand, it's like, okay, this is good to go. We call it the lift. We're going to start the lift, and we're going to move up the mountain to get in position to summit. As soon as you make that decision, I subconsciously, or even consciously, I can feel my stress levels beginning to build up, and the anxiety. You can feel a tightness, and then as you move up the mountain, it begins to get more and more serious, because the margin for error is very, very small. And unlike maybe someone's got a high pressure job in London where we are today, and if you make a mistake in a corporate environment, there's maneuver room. Worst case, maybe you're going to lose your job. But you got to do something pretty bad for that. I don't have to make a big mistake or bad decision. It can be quite a minor mistake, and somebody's potentially going to lose their life, be it maybe the client or one of the Sherpa team, or possibly even myself. So your decision making has got to be absolutely on point. And then by the time you get to the South Col of Everest, 8,000 meters above sea level, and let's try and put that in context. So we're in the BT Tower today, and we're pretty high, and we get this amazing view around us. And I don't know how high we are, a couple of 100 meters maybe. 8,000 meters above sea level. Now this is where airplanes fly. Next time you get in a plane and you're going on holiday somewhere, and captain says, we're cruising altitude and take seatbelt, have a quick look out the window. That's pretty much where we're climbing. There's no rescue. You can't get a helicopter there. You're not going to get a rescue team in to pick you up anytime soon. So everything is on the line. Everything. And you're in what's known as the death zone. That even with supplementary oxygen, the body is dying. And how long you got, you don't know. It's a ticking time bomb. Tick, tock, tick. For how long? Again, you don't know. It's an unknown. It's an uncontrollable. So you're trying to deal with all these uncontrollables and deal with the controllables. And I employ something, I call it binary thinking. I cut everything else out. Because at 8,000 meters, you're stressed, you've got anxiety running, you've got someone's life in your hands. You're the go, no go man. You've got some of these ambitions and dreams. You've got a high performing, to use your term, a high-performing Sherpa team around you, looking at you, waiting for that decision. Are we going to go today? Are we going to go tomorrow? Are we going to wait at the col? What are the oxygen levels? And all the time, even with supplementary oxygen, your brain is being starved of the very thing it needs to operate with. which is O2. And you know what happens. The first thing that gets eroded away when you are starving your brain of oxygen is your capacity for rational thought, your capacity to make decisions, which is irony, really, because you're in the most dangerous environment, arguably, in the world. You've got somebody who's in your charge, and you've got to make rational decisions while starving your brain of oxygen. Are you kidding me? Of course I'm stressed. Now, there might be 5 or 6 Sherpas, paying clients, my own life. We're worried about crowds. We're worried about the weather. We're worried about oxygen levels. And then we've got to step out at night and start moving in an upward direction when every single fiber in your body is saying, go back down. You shouldn't be here. Human beings don't exist at 8,000 meters above sea level. And then you've got to persuade your clients that this is the right thing to do. Yeah, I mean, I'm properly stressed. I think there's no room for self-doubt, and a lot of the audience has probably seen, Nims and his 14 Peaks. I think it's been on the show, and Nims is one of these characters that's got so much self-belief and so much confidence, and I'm also a confident guy. I know, and that's my confidence. I think to a certain extent comes from the knowledge that I can perform when it really matters. That I've been working on Everest since 2004, but I've been living and working in the mountains since I was 17, 18. There is a real depth of experience that I know I can pull on. David Goggins refers to the cookie jar, and you deposit in that jar. And then when you need to, you can put your hand in the jar, and there is an understanding or a knowledge base within that cookie jar that you can withdraw from. And those deposits come from experience. We were talking about hacks earlier. There is no hack to experience. And when I'm performing at my very best, my confidence is high. And I think certainly for me, when my confidence is high, there is very little self-doubt. Yeah, the demons might be chipping away at you. They might be trying to find a chink in your armor to try to wheedle their way in and to manifest themselves in an ugly manner, to try to derail the mindset which is required for high performance, for confidence, whatever you want to call it. That bulletproof mindset that we all try to achieve. But the negativity that we can generate within ourselves can be very destructive. And the way that I really focus is, partly binary thinking, cut away the fluff. I'm a firm believer that really critical decisions have to be based on logic and not emotion. At the same time, when I start to struggle with that philosophy, I then think of the children, which is emotional thinking. But I use it in a positive way whereby I dispel the demons by telling myself that if I let emotions seep in, I'm potentially going to make a poor decision, not a decision based on logic. And by doing so, it's going to sound quite dramatic, I might die. So I play out a scenario of what does that look like, or what would that look like at home? And by doing so, it keeps me very focused, and it allows me to dispel the demons or the negative mindsets that may be eroding.
So what you go confidence. Through almost like a role play of your wife
exactly
and your children
that. It's vision.
Dealing with the news that you've died on the mountain.
Exactly.
Right.
It's generating a vision, is using, trying to play a scenario in my head of what would that look like. And it's obviously a pretty ugly scenario, but I use it in a positive way to enable me to dispel the emotion, to put down the demons. Very simply, because it's a it's a scenario that I would never want to play out for real. And by doing so, it fortifies me in a way whereby I am never going to let that happen. What do I need to do to inhibit that?
Have you ever thought it will?
There's been moments that I thought, oh, this is great. Not working on Everest, but on other mountains.
Yeah.
I mean, before becoming a professional mountain guide, I climbed for fun. I was once heralded as one of the best high altitude climbers globally. Whether that's an accolade that was right or wrong, it's neither here nor there. But we were operating at quite a high level, and there were scenarios at times you think, ooh, we may have overstepped the mark here. This is actually going in the wrong direction. Or you're ice climbing or you're mixed climbing in Scotland and the weather's horrendous, and everything is reliant on a pick placement, the tiny weeny pick on your ice axe, and is wobbling in a placement. You think, my God, if that pops, this is going to get really ugly really quickly. So there've been scenarios that have been less than ideal, but I don't think you ever get in as, you certainly don't start on a journey thinking you're not going to come back. No, it's not as if I'm on some special forces mission where the odds are stacked against you and things like that. We're very careful with our preparation and planning, and we try to mitigate risk as best we can. But the story was, we came across, I say we, it was Dorji and myself, and we came across a stranded climber, for want of a better word, at Camp 4 on Lhotse. So Lhotse is a neighboring peak, fourth highest mountain in the world, neighboring peak to Everest. And this was back in 2013. And essentially, Mr. Lee, who's a Taiwanese climber, he climbed Lhotse, he's come down, and I don't quite know the ins and outs, but he was suffering from high altitude pulmonary and cerebral edema, so swelling on the brain, fluid on the lungs. He's in a really bad state, and his team didn't have the infrastructure in place to look after him. And then they hid the situation from the rest of base camp because they're trying to sort it out themselves. And anyway, he was essentially left, and we came across him at the high camp. And the first thing I knew about it is one of the doctors at base camp. So there's something called the HRA, the Himalayan Rescue Association. It's a non-profit, and they put doctors in at base camp to look after the clients and people like me, but also the Sherpas. And we get a call over the radio, and the doctor, Rachel, I think her name was, can you just have a look in one of the tents? We're getting reports that there's a climber that needs some help. So we're like, well, Rachel, there's no one else here. It's just Dorji and myself. She goes, just go and have a look in some of the tents, because the tents are often left up. So we're like, okay, well, we just climbed Everest and we just climbed Nuptse the day before. This is the year that I did the trilogy of climbing these 3 peaks. So, I'm physically knackered. Dorji is tired. I don't think Dorji ever gets knackered, but he's tired. So we look in the tents and there's no one there. And there's 2 tents about 50 yards beneath us. And I know 50 yards isn't very much, but at 8,000 meters, it feels, it could be like 20 miles away. And I look at Dorji, and Dorji looks at me. I'm like, okay, scissors, paper, stone. Let's see who goes down there. I lose. I go down. Jesus. So I go down there, open up one of the tents, and then there's this Taiwanese guy in there. I'm like, Jesus. Okay, Rachel, there's somebody here.
And was he still coherent at this stage?
No, he was unconscious at this stage, but he's breathing. He's alive. The tent's a disaster zone. There's vomit in there, and it's like, his down suit's ripped open, there's a down everywhere. And it's just a really ugly situation. So as we'll go in there, get on the radio, and Rachel was brilliant. She was helping me through the whole thing. And then a couple of other climbers turned up. One was they're both Australian, and they were both climbing Lhotse without oxygen. And one of them was, I don't know if he was a doctor or a paramedic, but he was able to assist me injecting Mr. Lee with dexamethasone, which is a steroid-based drug. And this had quite a profound effect on him. And he regains consciousness. He's trying to talk to me. He's relatively coherent. He can squeeze my hand. He's responding to various tests we're doing on him. But it's now night, and there's no way we can extract him at night time. And I stay up with him throughout the night. I said to Dorji, there's no need for you to be involved with this. Go back to our tent, get a good night's sleep. We're potentially not going to need your strength tomorrow. So go back to the tent, get a good night's sleep. I'll deal with this for now. And then at some stage, I've climbed these 2 other mountains over like 3 or 4 days. I'm physically exhausted. I'm with Mr. Lee throughout the night. I set an alarm, and I'm waking up every 20 minutes or so to check on him. But at some stage, I drift off, and during the night, and I wake up, and he's not breathing. So, Christ, I've kind of certain degree of responsibility here. I've let him down. He's not breathing, and then tried to call Rachel on the radio, but I forget what time it is. It's 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, whatever. It was a long time ago. Can't really remember. And I'm going into a certain extent into panic mode a little bit, trying to get Rachel on the radio. But not only have I fallen asleep, but I've left the radio out, and the batteries have got cold, so I can't get Rachel. She's probably in bed anyway. But the HRA there's always somebody on the end of the radio. But I kind of know what I need to do. What's Rachel going to tell me? Sticking with more decks? Well, there's only so much decks the body can take. And I revert back to being a Boy Scout aged 12, 13 on a first aid course. And if somebody's not breathing and you can't detect a heartbeat, well, you do CPR. Now, admittedly, I don't know how long he's been not breathing for, but I feel the compulsion to try something. And I revert back, I'm 12. And, was it Resusciani or something that they were called? And those rubber doll things. I've never done it for real. And, it's a horrible situation. It's pitch black. It's bloody freezing. And I'm like, okay, let's do CPR. So I start doing CPR. And I don't know if you've ever done it. It's quite exhausting. It's much harder than you think it's going to be. And I don't know how long I need to do it for. Because my first aid training was you do CPR until somebody is more qualified than you comes along and says you can stop or you continue or whatever. But there is nobody coming along. We're at 8,000 meters on Mount Lhotse or 7,800 or wherever we are. So I do it for as long as I can. And then I stop. And I think, Christ, he's dead. I think, no, he can't be dead. This is on my watch. I can't let him down. But so you get back to it. And it was maybe, I don't know, hour and a half, couple of hours. And every time I'd stop, I think you can't stop. Because you stop, he's going to die. So you've got to try something. And then finally I get a warm up the battery. So I actually put them down my underpants. I think, okay, how can I? So I got like 8 AA batteries down or the battery pack, in my down suit, not quite down my underpants, trying to warm it up. Batteries comes alive. I get Rachel, and it's like, okay, well, Rachel, what do I do? And she's like, okay, what's the situation? What are its stats? And so I explain all that, and she's like, well, you got to call it. What do you mean I got to call it? Like, well, and then if you remember watching ER and things like this, and then you got to, the guy is kind of dead. And I'm struggling with all of this, and I kind of just remember sitting back, and it's just about dawn now, perhaps a little bit later. And then there's a crunch, crunch, crunch outside. You can hear crampons in the snow. And I don't know if it's somebody coming up or coming down. And then the zipper zips open. And it's Dorji. Dorji's head comes into this tent, and I'm devastated. And he looks at me and says, so he's been listening on the radio. He's like, so what do we do? And Dorji, man, this isn't why we do these things. I'm really tired. Quite. And he looks at me and just says, he's dead. There's nothing you can do. And I just look at this guy, and he's his head is in my lap. Oh, sorry about that. this is like 10 years on, I still struggle with this. And Dorji just says, we got to climb. Dorji, we got to climb. Look, there's this guy. I didn't even know his name at the time. There's this guy literally in my lap. I can't climb. And he just looks at me and goes, I've always wanted to climb Lhotse. We should climb. And we're not climbing for him. We're climbing for me. And he knows me so well. Oh, really sorry. He knows me so well, and he knows exactly how to pull the right strings.
Yeah.
And I think that's so telling of when you put together a team that really works. You know exactly what everybody needs on that team in a time of crisis. Whether they need to find that extra gear, or whether in that scenario, whether in that moment, that individual, I don't think it is, but let's call it vulnerability, what he or she needs to get over that. And Dorji just hit all the right notes. And I think it's partly indicative of what an amazing man he is, but also the culture that over years, all of us have put together in that situation. And I was conflicted. I put on my crampons and I left Mr. Lee in that tent, and we climbed. And it's been very easy for somebody out there to say, well, perhaps you should have done this or should have done that. But for me in that moment, or for us in that moment, I mean, Mr. Lee was dead. There's nothing we could have done anymore to try to look after him. And we climbed. And what's the phrase? You fall off a horse, first thing you got to do is get back on it. And I think it was perfect. I remember coming back down, we climbed Lhotse. Somebody at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we get caught in a storm on the way down. We climbed these 3 peaks, and heralded as quite a big thing in the climbing world at the time. And we come down in a storm, and I'm like, oh Christ, what else can be thrown at us? And we get back down to the high camp, and Dorji's busy packing various things up. And I just said to him, I just need a few minutes.
Yeah.
And went back into the tent with Mr. Lee and just sort of sat there. And just try to deal internally with what had happened overnight. And then, a Sherpa team was coming up to try to initiate a rescue. I mean, they're obviously too late by probably a couple of days. And I just remember zipping Mr. Lee into a sleeping bag and, closing the tent door on him and walking away. I don't think I have processed what happened. I'm still quite bitter with the logistical team that was looking after him. I've never spoken to them about it. I've got to know them relatively well since. I've never spoken to them about it, which perhaps I should. I
wonder why you haven't. You strike me as the kind of person that would go straight in and go, listen, the next person in that position doesn't die, and here's how they don't die.
And they shouldn't die. And hey, it's that particular logistical outfit. I mean, they've got a lot better now, but they had an awful track record back then. And yeah, maybe there was a duty that I should have done to try to put things in place that sort of thing, because it was avoidable. It was totally avoidable. But I don't think I have processed. I'm really bad at putting things like that into a closet and closing the door. And I've experienced, a lot of friends of mine have died in the mountains or rock climbing or whatever it is that they're doing. And I don't think I've ever fully processed things. And I think partly it's the generation that I'm from. I think it's partly, this is going to sound rubbish, I think it's partly because I'm a guy, and there is this sort of stigma around that you don't show weakness, and you just deal with things. But we all know that that's wrong these days. And over the last few years, I have been investing time in myself, which I think is such an important thing to do. If a friend comes up to you and says, hey, I need help with something, I'm trying to process this, or I'm going through a divorce, or my dad's just died, or I've done this, or whatever it is. you help that individual. You maybe sit down with them, you spend time with them, you try to get them through the trauma of whatever trauma it is that they're experiencing, and try to put them in a better place. Well, why wouldn't we do that to ourselves? Now, I know people are, and the culture that we're in today is much better, but we'd invest time in others. Why don't we invest more time in ourselves? And I'm beginning to do that and understand that these things do need closure, and they do need to be an open dialogue with people. And my wife's fantastic for doing this. Well, I mean, it's really interesting one, isn't it? Because it's people that you leave behind. And I don't know the stress and anxiety. I mean, I was talking about the stress and anxiety of Summit Day on Everest. But what is the stress and anxiety of those that don't come? That those that aren't there in the moment, going through the processes of the decision making, and Jazz doesn't know what the weather is. She doesn't know what the how the clients are, or the oxygen levels and things like this. All she sees, for better or for worse, these days, we've all got trackers and things like that, and you can track you up the mountain and all these things. She knows what it's entailed. I mean, she's heard a story about Mr. Lee, or the Sherpa that I pulled off the fixed lines, who he got hit by a rock and half his head fell off, and and she knows the attrition rate with my friends, and but I don't know what she goes through. I mean, we talk about it sometimes, and I mean, there's a couple of sort of anecdotal stories that perhaps shows you a little bit about what she goes through, and what the children go through. The children are now 9 and 11. They have an understanding about what daddy does, and they have an understanding about the dangers. Whereas when they're younger, daddy's gone climbing mountains, and that's really jolly good fun. And I was on K2 last year in Pakistan, a much harder mountain to climb. And I'm there with a client, and we were on Summit Day, and my tracker glitched. And instead of going up, all of a sudden, it's moved significantly in a downhill direction.
Oh.
And Jazz is, oh Christ,
he's fallen.
He's fallen. The only way you can move that far in that short space of time is he's fallen. Now, and it's one of those amazing things, isn't it? I used to go to the Himalayas and be off radar for 6 weeks. And that old age adage of no news is good news. Well, unfortunately today, I'm getting my phone out. We are all connected all the time. And there is an expectation that we can check in whenever we want. But sometimes, for whatever reason, we can't. The battery dies, or there's no signal, or we've forgotten, or we've mislaid our phone or device. But all of a sudden, there's this tracker now that I use, and Jazz is thinking, Christ, he's fallen. What can I do? What happened? What happened? Luckily, she's got the depth of experience, and she's experienced many ascents of Everest, and K2's new, but she checks one or two of the other trackers of the party, and everybody else is moving in upward direction. So she's like, okay, let's not panic just yet. People are still moving up. So, but that's because she's educated in what I do. But for that moment, she's like, nice. And what's running through her mind? Well, another time, it's actually just after Mr. Lee. So I climbed these mountains, these 3 mountains. I'm away from base camp for about a week. And I made a slip with my vocabulary. I said to Jazz over the telephone, oh, sweetheart, I'm going to, I leave base camp tomorrow. We're off to climb Nuptse, Everest, Lhotse. And I'll be gone for a few days. Using the terminology few in a fairly ambiguous. A week later, I'm still not back. And I've been dealing with Mr. Lee, and there's been a couple of text messages from the sat phone, because I carry a sat phone. But my logistical provider back then, a really colourful character called Henry Todd, is concerned. And he knows Jazz. Henry's in his 70s now. And he knows Jazz. So he decides he's going to ring up Jazz and just say, everything is okay. Because even back in 2013, the information highway is alive and kicking, and word's going to get out that this guy's dead and I'm involved and it's going to be on Twitter or whatever it is pretty quickly, and you can get information through third-party sources which perhaps isn't substantiated. And he's like, Christ, I got to let Jazz know that everything is actually okay. So he rings her up on a sat phone. But a sat phone's got a very specific number, plus 881. I think a sat phone number is. I think it's 881. But it's not my sat phone. Somebody else's sat phone. So why is somebody else ringing her up on an unknown sat phone number? Well, why do you get in contact when no news is good news?
Yeah.
Well, you only get in contact for one reason. When something bad has happened. Actually, it's just Henry being kind. But Henry has the foresight of knowing that Jazz is going to panic. And apparently, she picks up the phone, heart palpitations, everything else, and Henry just blurts out, he's absolutely fine. Before she can say anything. Just to... Yeah. And, there's two... anecdotal stories there about the danger of connectivity that we have that is remote and virtual. Who was it? Johann, I forget what his book was called. The opposite of addiction is connection. Johann, anyway, his name eludes me. And I think it's absolutely right. We feel that we are connected in this day and age, but actually we are less connected than we ever have been. Despite the fact that I can sit here and I could be talking to my wife virtually. But yeah, and it's one of those fascinating things about how this technology can inhibit sometimes high performance. You're wearing a whoop. Yeah. So it gives you all the data you need to generate high performance. It gives you sleep. It will give you training zones and all sorts of things. I mean, it's a brilliant technological aid to performance. Yeah. At the same time, we can get lost in data. We can get lost by that lack of connectiveness, which I believe deep down we need as a species, as a society.